Ready to install your FoxAlien 20-watt laser? Then stick around because that's what we're doing in this episode. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of James Dean Designs. If you love laser and CNC work, make sure you hit that button to subscribe to the channel and get all the latest videos. Now in today's episode we're going to be taking a look at the FoxAlien 20-watt diode laser. You can buy this as a bundle package when you purchase a 4040 XE, or you can buy it as a standalone item to be able to upgrade that machine later, or install it on another machine because it has a standard 3-pin connector, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. In today's episode we're going to unbox it, see what you get for your money, talk about the specifications of the laser and what makes this particular one so interesting. We're then going to move on, get it installed and set up and do some very basic tests to make sure it's all running correct before we get to the fun part where we can experiment and play about with different materials. As always, timestamps will be in the description area, so do check it out along for any links for the materials and equipment we're using today. It's where I put all the useful information. Now, before we jump into all of that, I'm going to just use a quick clip from a previous laser video that I've done before, just to talk a little bit about diode lasers. The more you understand about them and kind of the way they work, it just makes things easier going forward to understand things like focal length and how it plays a part on your laser engraving. So let's jump into that clip now. So to get the most out of our laser, we need to understand a bit about how it works. And as you can see, I've spared no expense on this demonstration for you. Now we start with the diode laser that will be fixed to the Z-axis. At the bottom of your laser you will have a lens. And if you imagine these copper wires to be the light coming out of the laser or your laser beam, and at some point along that beam there will be a focal point. The reason this is so important is if you imagine the energy of the laser, at that focal point now is where it's going to be most optimal for cutting or burning the wood. The easiest way to explain this is probably if you have a sharp pencil and you drew a line, you'd have a very thin, crisp line. If you had a blunt pencil and drew a line, you would have a slightly wider, softer edge line. And that's basically the difference between whether you're cutting here or above or below it. So there you will have a very crisp, sharp line. Above or below you will have a wider, softer line. Above or below will still burn the wood, but there is the point that we're aiming for to be doing our cutting and burning. So now we understand a little bit more about diode lasers and kind of how they work with focal lengths. Let's move on and unbox the laser itself, see what you get in there, and then talk a bit about the specifications. You essentially get 4 items with the kit. You get the safety glasses, the case and the cleaning cloth. It's nice that they give you the case and cloth to look after the glasses because those are crucial for your eyesight. You get the depth stop for the focus of the laser. We'll talk about that more when we get onto the setup portion of the video. You get the cables for connecting it to your machine. There is a long and a short one depending on what machine you are using, but essentially the connectors on both ends are exactly the same. And finally we have the laser itself. Now I should mention at this point, since FoxAlien sent me this laser, they have released a V2 version. So the contents of your box may be slightly different, but in essence the laser is the same. They just added some things like a shield on the front to help with protection. So let's move on and talk about the laser itself. Well, it has a fairly standard layout. We've got the control board at one end, then we have the fan and the heatsink that help keep everything cool. In the middle of this is the diode with the focus lens on the end of it. Now the size of it looks fairly standard, but if I bring in my unbranded laser, we can see there is a slight difference. The unbranded laser is 33mm wide and is designed to sit in something like a 3018 with a smaller diameter spindle. Now the FoxAlien laser is 40mm wide and designed to sit in a 52mm holder, such as the one on the 4040 XE that's designed to take the 300-watt spindle. So that's one thing to note, that if you are planning to install this on a smaller machine, you will need the correct size holder for it. Now if we move on and talk about the power of the laser itself, this is always the grey area I talk about, where manufacturers try and overrate what their lasers actually do, but quality manufacturers such as FoxAlien give you all the values up front. Now this has a 20-watt input, which means the optical output is 5.5 watt, and that really determines what we can do in terms of cutting and engraving, which we'll move on to later. But most of the materials that we would expect it to do, it can handle easily because 5.5 watt output is really powerful. But the thing that actually makes the FoxAlien laser really unique and cool is it has laser compression technology. Now, in essence, what that means is as the laser comes out of the lens and is focused into its point, that point is just a bit more precise, as small as 0.1 millimeters. So going back to my analogy that I was saying earlier about the pencil, if you're using a sharp pencil, basically this is going to mean it's even sharper. And that precision and that point just means that we can engrave with more detail, cut with more precision, and it should also cut a little bit deeper as well because that point is a bit sharper. So yeah, definitely a really cool feature about this FoxAlien laser. Laser beam compression technology. Sounds like something from a spy movie. Let's move on, get it installed onto the 4040 XE and connect it up and show you just how easy that is. So imagine recording a video and not turning your microphone on. So I'm going to try and talk over the top of these clips just to show you what's actually going on. Now what I'm saying at this point is take some sort of marker or pen and place a line across your spindle. This is so that once you've taken the spindle out and you need to put it back into place at a later date, you know the exact depth that your spindle was set to. At this point, I'm advising to lower the Z-axis down so your spindle is touching the bed itself. The reason for this is when we come to undo the bolts to release the spindle, you don't want it falling through, so it just stops it dropping all the way down and then hitting the bed later, possibly causing damage. Next, we're going to unplug the power cables for the spindle itself and just move those out of the way. Next, we're going to come in with the Allen key and we're just going to slacken off the two bolts on the right hand side. The reason for this is so that the left two bolts hold the carriage in place to stop anything moving out of position, especially if you've already trammed your machine up. So with the two bolts released, we can now take the spindle out. Obviously, because we lowered it down, it didn't drop as we slackened the bolts off and it comes out nice and easy. So with the spindle removed, it's an ideal time to make sure this is all clean back here and that the thread is lubricated. For the purpose of today though, I'm just going to continue. Now in the holder itself, there are 4 grooves where the laser drops into. So it should go in nice and easy. Make sure to catch it at the bottom as it slides through. If for any reason you are struggling to get it in, make sure both bolts have been slackened off. You can always use something like a flat-headed screwdriver just to widen this slightly, but don't apply too much pressure because it should drop in fairly easy anyway. Now as you lower it down, it should stop about when it gets to the fan because that is a fraction wider and it makes it the ideal position to sit it in. Now it's going to come back in with the Allen key to tighten this up. Make sure the 2 wires on the side are not really rubbing the metal. You don't want to cause any damage to those. So I'm just going to lift it back up a fraction so it's not quite touching that and pinch all the bolts up. So now we're going to bring in the cable, and on the connector you will see that one side has 2 little arrows, the other side has the 3 terminal pins. The 2 arrows go on the side of the control board. So I'm just going to bring this over the top, drop it in, and when you push it in it should click slightly to guarantee that it's held in place. Can take a little bit of pressure. There we are. Now, we will see that my wiring loom is already held in by a zip tie that I put when I've assembled this machine first. So I'm going to just tuck the wire in behind the laser itself and make sure that the 2 live and negative cables are also tucked in there. You can put something like a zip tie just to ensure that everything stays nice and secure. We obviously need this in place because it's still connected to the limit switch itself. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the cable and put it behind this setup itself and bring it out to the side. Now I just want to secure it to the wiring loom as well. The reason being, as this moves around, I don't want to put any unnecessary pressure on the terminal itself. So I'm just going to use a temporary zip tie, one of the Velcro kind, wrap it around, make sure it is secure, and then tighten it up. Now that will just mean that as all this moves about, it holds everything in place and it stops putting any unnecessary pressure on that terminal. Now the cable itself isn't quite long enough to go through the wiring loom. What I would suggest is if you plan to use your laser very frequently, consider buying a longer cable or even extending the one that comes with it so you can feed it through the wiring loom, and that way you can always keep the cable at the side and switch between the two anytime that you need to. But for now I'm just going to feed this off to the side of the machine and then round to the back of my controller. Connect the other end of the cable to the 3-pin port on the back of your control box. Make sure the switch on the side is set to laser. So I told you that would be easy to install, and it really was. So let's move on and just make sure everything's working as we expect. Now if you've seen my previous laser videos, you'll know my preference is Lightburn for running and doing laser work. Check out the link in the corner to the basic guide for using Lightburn. However, for today's video, we're going to be using Laser GRBL. The reason for this is it's free and accessible to everyone. You don't need to worry about trials or having to pay for additional software. So we're going to use that to get the machine up and running and check everything's working as it should. So now we're at the PC. The first thing you'll want to do, if you haven't done so already, is head over to lasergrbl.com and go to their download section and download Laser GRBL and get it installed. Now I've already got Laser GRBL installed, so I'm going to open this up now and we'll maximize this up. So most people will be using this laser as an upgrade attachment and already have experience of running their machine. For those of you that don't, I will be running through the next few steps fairly quickly as a result, but if you are in any doubt, then check out the link in the corner now for my previous laser setup guide. It is on the 3018 machine, but all the principles in it are still relevant for both machines. So if you haven't installed your machine already, you'll want to come up to the tools and install the CH340 driver. Click this, run through the installation. Also make sure your USB cable is connected before doing so. That will allow your machine to then talk to the PC and vice versa. The next thing you'll want to do is come to the device manager. Click the start menu, type device manager and open this up. Come down to ports. See the port that your driver is assigned against. So we've got the CH340 against COM port 5. That's really important. So then we'll close this down, come back to Laser GRBL, make sure our COM port is set to number 5. And at this point we're then going to click connect and make sure it connects up to the machine. That beep tells us that it has connected. It can detect that it's running GRBL 1.1H. I should also point out at this time, I don't actually have the power turned on to the machine. That's why you can't hear the fan. I will turn it on shortly, but you can do this initial setup work without the power being turned on. Now that is the basics, but I will just run through the layout of Laser GRBL in case you're not familiar with it. We have this area up here where we can type G code in and see the progress of our files as we are exporting and burning them in a little bit. We have the control area down the bottom here. You can control the speed at which it travels, the direction, and then the length at which it travels. So step 100 would mean 100 millimeters. If you brought that down to step 50, it would be 50 millimeters. Down here we have a few buttons with a few commands. As you hover over them, it does tell you so to be able to reset the board, do your homing sequence, unlock the machine, and also set the 0. We're going to come back to this shortly and add a couple of buttons which makes our life a little bit easier. The first thing I'm going to do though is come up and add a control so we can adjust the height of our Z axis. So we're going to come up to GRBL, come down to settings, and then we're going to come over to jog control and turn on show Z up down. Now there's a lot of laser machines that don't have a Z axis that you can control. The FoxAlien machine does, so we're going to turn this on and it will allow us to control that Z axis. So when we click save, we can now see this extra option has appeared down here in the jog control area, where we can move the Z axis up or down in increments of 0.1, 1 millimeter or 10 millimeters. And we will use that shortly when setting the focus. The other thing I'm quickly going to do is just come up here where it says type G code, enter $, hit enter, and just to get all of our settings on screen. Now if you are familiar with lasers, you will know that you have to switch the machine between spindle mode and laser mode. We can see this setting here called $32. It's a Boolean option which basically means on and off. 0 equals off and 1 will equal on, which puts it into laser mode. Now we can type this manually up here, or we can load in some custom buttons to make our life a little bit easier. So I'm coming down to this section here where it says we can add custom buttons. I'm going to right click and click import custom buttons, and I've got this file on my desktop already. As always, links will be in the description area to download this yourself. We'll click open and we will load them in. We'll click yes, yes and yes. We can now see we have 3 new icons that appear. The first one is to turn the laser on but at a low power in order to help us focus it. Because this is a fixed focus lens, it isn't always needed, but it can still be useful for positioning. The next one is laser mode on. That setting that I just spoke about, $32, it will turn that on for us automatically without typing the G code in. The next one is to turn the laser on for 2 seconds. Again, this can help with focusing or positioning your work. This button and the I button do very similar things. The only difference is the I will leave it on permanently, whereas that will turn the laser off automatically after 2 seconds. So what I'm going to do is click laser mode on, and as we can see, that's just sent a command across, $32 equals 1. So we know it's now in laser mode. So before we go any further, I'm going to do a very basic test and make sure that the laser actually turns on. So you may hear the fans kick in off the controller. And what I'm simply going to do is click on the icon, and all being well, the laser should turn on. Excellent. Hopefully the camera can just pick that up. But there's a very small tiny dot there, and it just means the laser is turning on, which is exactly what we need. So I'm going to turn it back off now. So now that we know the laser turns on, I think we can move forward and do a very basic job just to see how the laser actually performs. The first thing we'll want to do is set the depth of the Z axis. This is so that the laser is correctly focused. So we're going to move the depth stop now to underneath the laser itself. And then slowly lower the Z axis down until it touches the top of that stop block. Perfect, it's just about touching the top of that block. Now the other thing you'll notice is my material is supported on 2 bars at the moment to lift it up off the bed. You may have to do this because the FoxAlien cannot lower the laser down enough to be able to get the 30mm clearance from the bed itself. So the way we get around that is to raise our material up to the laser, and then it's good to go. So with that touching, I'll pull the stop out of the way and just place it over to the side. And we know the focus depth is now correct because that stop block is exactly what it needs to be. So we're going to come up and we're going to go to File, Open, and we're just going to load in this FoxAlien SVG file. Now this is just a simple vector outline file of the FoxAlien logo, and straight away we're presented with a couple of options. Border speed, this is the speed you want it to engrave at. Now 150mm per minute is pretty slow. We are just engraving here, not cutting, so I'm going to speed this up to make sure that it doesn't burn the MDF too much. So I think we're going to start at 1000. This is probably actually still a little bit too slow because this laser is powerful, but we'll see how we get on to begin with. We're going to leave laser on and laser off as M3 and M5. And then we're going to come down to S minimum and S maximum. This is the amount of power you want the laser to actually output. Now what we need to do at this point is come over and look at to what our $30 value is, which is 10,000. So the S max in theory should be 10,000. Now I'm never a fan of running my laser at full power. You can do it, but I always think it's going to last longer if we run it just below full power. So rather than put this at 10,000, I'm going to bring this down to 9,000. And what that basically means is it will run no more than 90% power, because 9,000 is 90% of 10,000. Now what you may have seen previously in other videos is you can change this value to 1000 to make life easier, but because it's already at 10,000 now, I'm just going to leave it at that, and then we're going to click create. Now we can see it's imported this SVG. The start position is this bottom left hand corner, or the origin is the bottom left hand corner, and we can see from the dotted lines the paths it's going to do in order to engrave this particular design. The other thing we can notice now is we've got some measurements around it. The width of it is 100mm and the height of it is 113mm. So you need to make sure you're using a piece of material that is big enough to be able to take that design. Now as I just mentioned, the start position for this design is in the bottom left hand corner, but we can see from my piece of MDF that the laser is roughly in the middle. So I'm just going to jog it over a bit to be more towards the far left hand corner as an initial start point. You can see this is at 50mm, so every time I click an arrow it will move 50mm, so we'll jog it across to that bottom left hand corner. And what we can do at this point is use those buttons that we just installed to see roughly where the laser is actually now positioned. Now with that being on low power, we can use this and drag the steps down to position it a bit more specifically near that bottom left hand corner. And turn the focusing off now. The next thing I'm going to do is set the 0 point, obviously, because that's always useful when we're doing a job, just so it knows where the start position needs to be. And that's basically it, so let's run our first test job. So all up and running straight out of the box, which is what we expect from a FoxAlien product. So let's move on to the fun part. Let's start doing the experimentation. Now, over the next couple of days, which obviously I will speed up on the video, I'm going to experiment with a few different items, cutting through wood, engraving wood, playing about with acrylic, seeing what we can do with paint on tiles and maybe trying to engrave a photograph on those. What I'll probably do is put them into a compilation and talk over the top and then do a roundup after that. So let's see how it comes out. So before we dive into the experimenting, I just want to talk about air assist. Now, in its simplest form, this means creating an airflow around where the laser is engraving to minimise the amount of smoke getting to the laser and also minimise the amount of residue left on the material, because the residue makes the laser less efficient as it's cutting. Now, in the past, what I've done is just use something like a small battery powered fan, sat it next to the laser, and that's created an airflow across the material as it's being engraving. But today I've brought a fish tank air pump. Now, these are fairly cheap. This one was about £15 off Amazon. It's got a variable control as well, so you can control the amount of air it is actually pumping out. Now, if you are doing things like cutting, a more high powered pump can be better, but for everything we're doing today, this is going to be sufficient. Now, in terms of setting it up by the laser, you can just simply feed the tube near where the laser is engraving, and that will kind of help. But what I've done is print a nozzle on the 3D printer. This really is a cheap alternative. FoxAlien sell much better versions of these machined out of brass. They're actually made by Jacob, who's part of their Facebook admin team, Laser Wizard. Check his link out to his channel in the corner. And the ones that FoxAlien sell, as I say, are made out of brass and they fit to the laser much better and are just going to be much more secure than my cheap version here. So definitely look at those if you are looking into air assist. But as I say, the purpose of air assist for today is just to make the laser more efficient and, all being well, get better results on our engravings and cuttings. So the first things that we're going to do is some speed and power tests, and we're going to do this on various material, including some wood, painted tiles, some acrylic, just to understand the feeds and speeds that we need to achieve certain things. This is always a good position to start with a laser, just so you really know what it's capable of at certain types of settings. So this really is one of the best ways to get to know your laser, by doing these tests, because it covers multiple materials and they are also future references to come back to whenever you're going to do a job. It gives you a good reference chart comparing speeds and power, so you can just look at them, know what depth of level of engraving you're looking for, and then put those settings straight into your software. We did it on a piece of wood, we did it on a spray painted tile, we also did it on a piece of spray painted clear acrylic. Obviously, with acrylic being clear, you need to put something on it to catch the laser, otherwise the laser goes straight through. I was really happy with all the results that I got from doing the power and speed test, so much so that I continued on and started to do an image engraving. Now, the image I started to engrave was of a lion. The video and the photos don't really do this justice, but there was a lot of detail in it and it actually gave a nice 3D texture as well, so I was really happy with that and moved on to doing the same with the spray painted tile. Effectively, you're just burning the paint off the top of the tile, but it gives a nice finish and you can still get a bit of the gloss tile coming through from underneath. And a bit like the wood, the detail in it was absolutely brilliant. At this point, you can apply something like a clear varnish or a clear spray on top just to seal the tile. Now, after that, I was pretty happy with all the results, so I decided to move on to doing a bit of cutting and again back to basics, doing some testing. So we just did a basic speed versus power test again, but for cutting, not engraving this time, just to work out roughly what speed we needed to get through this 2mm basswood, and it was 230 millimeters per minute at about 80%. As I say earlier, I never like to run my machine at 100% just because I think it will last a little bit longer, keeping it below that threshold. Once I was happy and we found a speed that I was comfortable with, I then moved on to actually doing a job, and I just cut out a bit of a simple design from the 2mm basswood. You will notice it's being held down with two pieces of metal either side, because 2mm basswood is quite thin. It can flex over time, so it's just useful to put something on top of it to hold it all in place. Once the design was finished, I popped out all the little bits in between it, took a bit of a look at the detail on it and was really happy. So I then decided to continue and actually do a second job of a similar style again to see how it came out. And again, once I popped out all the pieces, there was very little overburn on it because of using the air assist as well, but I did spray them black because I just think it looks a nicer finish, and these can be used as little decorations around the house, or maybe even possibly as bookmarks. I then moved on to doing a material that I've never done before, which is leather. I took a bit of a guess at the settings, and I did this at about 100 millimeters per minute at I think it was 80% power. Probably a little bit too much power, we could have gone a little bit softer, but it actually came out really well. The burn was nice and crisp. There was a little bit of black residue, that's why I say we could have reduced the power, but again, really happy for a first attempt at engraving leather, and would not hesitate at doing it again. Final test was using a piece of glass. We went over it with a Sharpie because again it needs something for the laser to actually hit. We then engraved on top of that Sharpie. Once it was done, cleaned all of the black pen off, and then took a look at the engraving, which was actually pretty good. Probably could have done with something like a flatter finish like paint rather than the Sharpie, but still very happy. Well, that's certainly been a fair few hours of engraving and cutting. I'm still seeing white spots from staring at the laser so much, so don't do as I did. Even with wearing safety glasses, don't stare at it too much because it's not good for your eyes. Ventilation, make sure everything's well ventilated. Extraction, I've talked about it before, but yes, some of the materials can give off toxic fumes, so just be careful. Now the laser itself, well, I've got to be honest, I'm really impressed with how everything's come out, especially this tile. Given that the image isn't actually that big, there is so much detail in it, and I'm really looking forward to actually doing a full scale design edge to edge on the tile, just to see how much detail we get featured in that. It just goes to show that laser compression technology does play a part in the amount of detail you get out of it. Now I am going to be leaving this setup on my FoxAlien 4040 for a while, just because it's a great combination. The laser with the belt, it just works really well. If this is something you're interested in, check out the affiliate links in the description below. They don't cost you anything, as I've said before. I just may get a tiny little bit back off the manufacturers just to help keep the channel going. Links in the description area. I'll also try and put information in the description area about the different feeds and speeds from all the pieces that I've been doing throughout this video. So yeah, as always, do check it out. Now I've got a lot of mess around me that I've got to get cleaned up from all that experimenting and the paint and the bits of wood and material, so I'm going to crack on with that now. As always, thank you very much for watching. Final thanks always to my patrons for helping keeping the channel going. I'll see everyone on the next episode.